So in the most recent quarter, US revenue grew 51% year over year to
Whoa.
1.25 billion. It had in Q3 of this year, it had 43% of US net gaming revenue and 25% of iGaming gross share as well. iGaming would be online casino games and all the rest, which has been
Yeah.
growing hugely in popularity. We talk about Evolution Gaming a lot. Evolution Gaming would be the company that operates a lot of these games. So it's growing industry. The US opportunity is absolutely huge. It is spending like crazy to do so in the short term, which will be a red flag for a lot of people. But remember, it's only legal in 23 states right now. This episode of the pod is proudly sponsored by Cadiz Inc. It trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker CDZI. Cadiz is a transformative water resource company that is making a significant impact with its $5 billion in water assets and $173 million in cash. The company is currently constructing a massive water pipeline, the largest in the Southwest, which is designed to ensure reliable water access for the region. Cadiz is actively combating the water crisis with game-changing infrastructure projects and strategic partnerships. Under the leadership of visionary CEO Susan Kennedy, who previously served as Chief of Staff to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Cadiz is set to provide innovative solutions and substantial value to both its shareholders and the communities it serves. Always doing your own research before making any investment decisions. The information provided here is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Emmet, how are we getting on?
Hello, Michael. How are you today?
I'm good. Did you survive the big freeze? 2025's big freeze?
Oh, ridiculous. I mean, honestly, nanny state, we were totally warned against this impending doom that was going to roll over our landscape. And granted, I'm living in a suburb.
I was about to say, this is a real flipping Dublin elite call. I think people were frozen over down south.
They were, yeah, I know, but there was so much news about it. It seemed like a super normal event. In fact, the Met Office had called it something like a multi-weather event, but I can't remember. There was even more dramatic language used, and I kind of felt it to be a little bit dramatic, to say the least.
Yeah. Once it goes beyond the pale, it's none of your purview. Is that it?
Yeah, says the guy in France.
I'm laughing. I'm looking at it 15 degrees and sunny out my window.
Oh, so you don't like the way I deal with the cold.
Yeah.
Mike, in a rare show of athleticism, I'm going to do today's podcast standing up, which is going to disprove any accusation that I cannot multitask. I mean, I used to wonder, the definition of multitasking is a man who can blink while he's chewing. Well, I'm actually going to talk while I'm standing. So there you go.
This is innovation like I'd never seen before. Before we get into the show, you want to drop a message first?
Oh, yeah. We are a founder-led business with a mission. And considering that there are a few New Year's resolutions that need a kick into action, I thought I'd tell our listeners about Horizon, which is, as our listeners know, a service run by me. It's a real money portfolio and a window into my investment decisions. What I find interesting with the benefit of hindsight is that it launched in the eye of a storm, really, in December 2019, which is a small pity because there was a SPAC bubble brewing and we were weeks away from a global event that clobbered almost everything except the Magnificent Seven. But it's also a blessing as it got me started and I will not stop. So at least Horizon started and I am not going to relent. And I may not have launched it at any other time. The mood was right at that moment. And to date, I've picked about 60 stocks. So that's about one pitch a month. And I've built a portfolio from those 60 pitches of 26 stocks. One of those positions today is up fourfold. 3 others are up at least twofold. And overall, it consists of probably 2 or 3 stocks that I believe fully will grow between 50 and 100-fold or even more in the next 15 years. And the reason I'm so confident about that is because I've been hunting mega winners my whole life, or at least ever since I noticed that Dell had grown 1,600-fold in the decade that was the 90s. I'm not sure if we'll ever have a 1,600 bagger. I mean, that is beyond a black swan event, but I have some giant winners in my life that has taught me the importance of Zen-like patience. Well, my call to action anyway to our listeners is to simply say, sign up to Horizon. Make it your New Year's resolution. Apart from watching me, you'll also get access to an incredible community, weekly updates, buy alerts, and a few surprises that are in the works that you know about, Mike. I believe for those who have grit and patience, it will be the best investment of their lives. And I plan to make it the best investment of my life. And I also have three amazing businesses in the works that I'll have pitched by around St. Patrick's Day, which is 17th of March. So 1 month between now and then. If you're interested in joining, email Frank at mywallstreet.com. That's mywallst.com. Frank at mywallstreet.com. He has no less than 3 coupon codes left in his arsenal. So if you want to kick your new year off with Horizon, email Frank at mywallstreet.com.
Perfect. Okay, so theme of the show today, we're going to actually discuss Irish stocks. We've been researching. Yes. But before we get into it, I just want to do a quick 5 minutes on TikTok. So I don't want to go over 5 minutes really, because I feel like it's going to change about 5 times in the space of between now and Sunday of what's actually going to happen. But it seems like it's the closest it's been to actually getting banned since, I don't know, 2016, since it's been threatened forever. And it's a bit of a kind of boy who cried wolf situation where it's been threatened to be banned so many times, people don't really take it seriously. But Sunday, January 19th is kind of the cutoff point, and it looks like the Supreme Court seems to not be interested in stopping the ban, which Biden put in place in April. I don't know what will happen in between now and then. Will Trump come in and save the day? Will it be a popularity move? Whatever else. But just in the hypothetical that TikTok does go away, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on kind of the big winners and losers that come out of it. Like, as in, Facebook is an obvious one. Google is an also obvious one. Any other advertising platforms. And then some of the losers, like, Jesus, I think there was rumors that China wants to sell it off to Elon Musk as if he doesn't have enough on his plate already. Join it with Twitter, which would be a disaster then for Facebook. So there's so many implications involved. I just want to hear your thoughts maybe and see where you're going. And you can completely plead the fifth and be like, let's decide when it actually happens, if it actually happens, what'll go about it next.
Yeah, my first sense on it is that it won't happen, believe it or not. But
that's how I feel too. That's how I've always felt. It kind of almost crept up on me that it was like, oh, it might actually be gone on Sunday.
Well, the one thing I noticed last night while I was doom scrolling on TikTok for a few minutes was that a few of the creators that I follow were now saying, American creators, go over to Instagram, follow me there. My career is about to take a bullet, which I thought was quite interesting because they don't agree with my sense, which is that it will be fine.
Are they just covering their bases? Yeah.
Perhaps. I mean, President-elect Trump has certainly indicated a softer approach. It's not so guillotine-edged. I think he's a fan of the platform. But I do think the really interesting thing that you touched on there was that even the vague possibility that Musk buys it, it would be a perfect purchase. Like if you own Twitter and now suddenly you have this other video-centric platform and you can combine them in some way. And I think he has a supervision for X as a platform, as a name, as a business. I think there's a very good dovetail joint to be made there.
Oh, I don't know. Just seeing what like Twitter has turned into in terms of kind of the sentiment and the type of content that goes up there. You're doing that to TikTok. I'm not sure. I don't really know. And I think you're right in saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't really discuss the implications until it actually happens. Because it's
immediately,
yeah,
it's true. But like Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, Snapchat, all these platforms will get an overnight boost as those who have actually built their big audience on TikTok run to another platform. It is really truly fascinating. I mean, 170 million users in the US is nothing 100%. To be snuffed at.
And not only 170 million users, but like a really hard to access demographic as well. That like 15 to 35 group, and more particularly the 15 to 24, where it's really tough for marketers to get access to.
There's a Chinese app I never heard of. I started to read around this very subject last night when you dropped me a message saying let's have an opinion on TikTok. And there's a Chinese app a company called Zhanghaozhou, which is more commonly known as Red Note. I really hope our Chinese listeners don't write in to tell me how to pronounce that. But Red Note is an app I had never heard of. It's
Yeah.
suddenly gained popularity in the US as a potential substitute. Have you heard of Red Note?
I have, but maybe I read this wrong. I thought that was ByteDance owned as well. Was I wrong?
I, I I think you're wrong, but
Okay.
I wouldn't go to court on it. I thought I mean, if it's a viable substitute, and if ByteDance is the enemy, it probably isn't. But if ByteDance is the enemy, but if Chinese apps,
In general.
permeating the
Yeah.
American public is the enemy, well, then I wouldn't be so keen to jump over to Red Note.
Yeah. 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 We'll probably have a longer discussion on it once we actually get, solidified news.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's mad. And even just considering that Trump is very keen on bringing in like trade restrictions on China and all the rest. I wonder, is this kind of a way of maybe like not extending an olive branch per se, but like having negotiations that aren't as important as flipping 100% tariffs on all Chinese goods or whatever else. Do you know what I mean? This is a segue to kind of have an adult conversation before maybe the real stuff starts. I don't know.
very possibly, or it could be just as simple that as since the time of Julius Caesar in the Colosseum, to win the crowd, you need to have a platform and you need to influence people. And Trump sees and knows that TikTok is a huge tool of influence. And no, I don't think anyone has mastered media as well as Trump over the last 30, 40 years. He's built himself into the president, the highest office in the world, you could argue, I think quite easily, and that's because he's used media in all its forms so effectively. And I just don't think he'd like to see TikTok taken in the neck.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Okay. Uh Main part of the show now. We're going to talk Irish stocks. And this was a fun exercise for me anyways because it had me asking the question an awful lot of, does that count as Irish? you know?
Yeah, I know. I
Where
was in the same boat. I was in absolutely in the same boat. And Mike, if I may just alert or tell our listeners that this came from a WhatsApp from a very old friend of mine, Kieran Power, who lives in Germany. And he said, could you just put a spotlight on some of the Irish businesses um, and talk about those companies? Because, I mean, Ireland has had an outsized impact, at least on the Western world. We all know that.
yeah.
So much for population emigrated to the UK or to the US. I think everybody knows someone Irish. So to our listeners who are non-Irish, you're going to love this. Of course you are. Sure, you know somebody who's Irish and you love us very much.
100%. And like we're a great country for claiming things,
Oh, jeez.
probably
Sure, we
because it
have to.
happens to us. Do you know what I mean? It happens to us so often. We get up in arms if someone calls Paul Mescal or Colin Farrell British, and then
Yeah.
half our soccer team has a Cockney accent. But it's a big thing with Irish stocks, and not so
Mm,
much because we're claiming them, but they're claiming us. Do you know what I mean? There's an awful lot of huge
mm.
companies that are domiciled in Ireland, and this goes beyond the tech and pharma tax loopholes that they're running, but companies that properly officially establish their HQ in Ireland, like Accenture is officially an Irish company. I don't know if we can claim them. Medtronic, I mean, they do employ half of Galway City, but they're from
Oh, yeah.
Minneapolis. Do you know what I mean?
Interesting.
Eaton Corp is a $130 billion energy conglomerate.
Yeah.
It's not Irish, it's American, but it claims to be Irish, at least for accounting purposes. And then here's a really good one for you. I thought this is hilarious. PDD Holdings, the owner of Timu and Pinduoduo.
Irish.
They're,
Pure Irish.
they're flipping Chinese for 30 years, but they're Irish since 2023.
Of
they're,
course they are.
they're HQ'd in Dublin. So there's an awful lot
You
of
need to
companies.
walk through the Silicon Docks down by the Grand Canal Basin, and you just see all the giants of Silicon Valley either have a properly big premises there with thousands of people or a plate on a door.
Yeah,
Berkshire Hathaway has a plate on a door on, I think it's Harrington Street. There it is, Berkshire Hathaway. You're like, what's going on there? I'd love to knock in and have a chat with Warren. But yeah, there is definitely, there's a whole strategic discussion as to why that's the case, but it's truly Irish is the conversation we're
yes.
about to have. And I
So
think it's worth. Sorry, Mike.
no,
Go.
no, no. I was going to say the truly Irish is kind of we sound a
Mm.
bit like flipping xenophobes here, or like they're
Yeah,
not really Irish, but truly
yeah.
Irish companies. I think was our was our remit for this episode. So I'll let you kick off with your first one.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think it's worth at least discussing the Irish Stock Exchange just for a
Oh, of
minute,
course,
because
yeah.
if you've touched on it there, there's those businesses that were born in Ireland and grew from Ireland and listed on stock exchanges overseas, and then there's the inverse, and then there's those who grew in Ireland and listed in Ireland. And the Irish Stock Exchange, its roots trace back to 1793. So that stock exchange is about 232 years old. And that was a time, way back then, was a time when there was growing trade and economic activity in Dublin. And Dublin was a prosperous city that was growing. And initially, trading in government bonds and a handful of company shares really took place in informal settings like coffee houses and taverns and pubs and the likes, wherever brokers could meet. That's where the deals were done. But by the early 19th century, all these ad hoc markets and places to meet consolidated and got formally structured into the entity that we now know as the exchange. And you and I, Mike, have been on that floor several times, most recently at Horizon Live in November. And it's a beautiful building. It's got the heritage and the history and all the rest. But there's loads of interesting stories about that exchange, which we'll keep for another podcast. But another point to just mention is that every country's stock market is a mini autobiography of that country. Just is. The range of companies listed on your local stock exchange paints a picture of your country's history and a glimpse into its future. And you'll find age old institutions in some countries like banks and utilities, which go back through decades and even centuries. And when I think of really old financial institutions, the stock exchange that springs to my mind is the London Stock Exchange, because it is arguably the financial center of the world. And then there's ambitious upstarts in technology and biotech. And for most people, they would think of the NASDAQ. So each stock exchange tells a story. And our stock exchange tells a story, and it only has 30 companies on its primary listing. Just 30. I could read them out here. I won't. I'll save our listeners. But all of that is to say, well, what's that tell us about our country, Ireland? It's small. There's only 30 companies listed. And when you read through the names, whether it's AIB or Cairn Homes or Great Western or Kenmare or Kerry, it's comprising of something to do with aviation, engineering, food, the story of Ireland. It's like a little book that tells the story of Ireland right through to Ryanair and Unifar at the bottom. So we have in every country a stock exchange, more or less in every first world developed country in the world, there's a stock exchange, and it is the story of that country. So, where am I going with that? I've kind of drifted off the path. What did you ask me again?
It's a good segue. It's a good segue, and it's a pity. I think you're talking about there's only 30 companies on the Irish Stock Exchange now. That's number greatly reduced.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot that this could be a completely separate conversation of how the Irish government doesn't reward stock investing at all, and feeds into other issues we're having. It feeds into our property crisis at the minute, because property became one of the only viable investments because of the tax system in place. And there's an awful issue with deemed disposal tax and not rewarding investors for good practices, essentially.
Yeah,
So, they
yeah.
brought in,
It's shameful. You're right. It's actually heartbreaking.
It was Brian Cowan, wasn't it, who brought in deemed disposal, where because, say, if you weren't, if you put your money away for 30 years in an index fund, instead of paying taxes on, you'll still get dividends, but instead of paying taxes on big dividends every year to the Irish government, that money wasn't seen. So they instead were like, okay, well, if you're putting it away like that, we're going to tax you anyways every 8 years, because we need to see some of that money coming in. It's awful.
It is awful. I have a real problem with that 8-year deemed disposal rule, which I think only Irish investors will be aware of.
And it's flipping 41%.
Look, I think it's criminal, but I don't
want
want
to. If it was 20%, it would be a crime. But it's the fact that it's so big as well.
It's an absolute disgrace. But you and I can walk into Paddy Power, Flutter, Betfair, Tony King, or whatever the new one is called, and sit there all day for the rest of our lives. And if we were particularly insightful and lucky and knew which horse was what, and walked home with tens of millions, not one penny is owed in tax. But if you do the prudent thing, which is invest in an ETF or equivalent, that in this country you have to suffer the wrath of an 8-year deemed disposal. It's apparent. It's just disgusting. Most of us, all of us, every penny I've ever invested in the stock exchange, every penny was after I paid tax. So if I earn €1, and let's for simple math say half of that comes into my pocket and goes back into the exchange, and I defer a pleasure. I take it like the definition of investment is foregoing a pleasure today in anticipation of something, a greater reward in the future. Well, I did a lot of that when I was young. I'm not I'm not going to tell any boohoo stories, but there's a whole bunch of things I didn't do because of my belief in the power of investing. And I put money that I pay tax on into shares that I will pay tax on when I dispose of them, which is fair. And I buy that. It's called capital gains. It exists everywhere in the world, although anything over 22% is absolutely measured as has a law of diminishing returns because it restricts the flow of capital around a society. But when you think of taxing an ETF, it's politically criminal, Mike. You've
Yeah.
obviously touched my hot button. It's disgusting. I think it is so bad that you can go into a bookies and pay nothing on your winnings. But if you do what's right by your family and for the financial prudence of this country, you'll be penalised. And whoever advised, whatever minister who brought in that law, I think should really stand to question and answer why they believe that's right. Now, I'm not the one balancing the books of Ireland Incorporated, but I'm certain that it's an immoral and unjust tax.
100% taxing unrealized gains. Shocking. Okay, let's get into the company. So, what do you
Oh,
got up
yeah.
first?
Okay. So I'm going to start with one that's more. So there's 30 companies, and sorry, on the Irish Stock Exchange. I think you mentioned that you're going to look at Irish companies that have listed abroad.
Yeah.
Am I right in saying that?
Well, yeah, one was just
Okay.
recently removed from the Irish Stock Exchange, unfortunately. But yeah.
Ah, okay. So I am going to go with two companies that are in that ring fence of the Irish Stock Exchange. And the first one is more of interest to me. I'm quite au fait with the business, and I think it's very interesting. And it's called Molten Ventures. And
Yeah.
Molten
It's a new one
Ventures.
to me now. I never heard this name before.
Oh, see, I know the. I don't want to say the founder, but let me explain. Molten Ventures was once called Draper Esprit, which is a very prestigious venture capital firm, and it's publicly listed. So it's a VC venture capital firm that's listed in Dublin and in London. And the guy who set it up in Ireland knew Draper, whose first name I've forgotten. It's obviously not Don Draper. That's Mad Men, but. Brian Caulfield is a wonderful investor, a wonderful venture capitalist, and a great person. And as far as I recall, he was the founder of Draper's pre-VC here in Ireland, and it's a firm I got to know when I founded my Wall Street, co-founded my Wall Street. It's now called Molten Ventures. So what it does is it provides public market shareholders with access to venture-backed private companies. Okay, so it's an asset class that's traditionally only accessible to private or institutional investors, and it typically invests in innovative tech startups from the seed stage through to later growth rounds. And the firm looks for companies with disruptive products and strong teams and all the things that a VC will typically look for. So, businesses like software, fintech, artificial intelligence, health tech, deep tech, space, quantum computing, all those businesses that are on the edge of the edge. And that's typically what what Molten goes for. And I happen, as I said, to know Brian Caulfield. And if his integrity and know-how still remains in that business, I have a strong feeling about it. So beyond simply providing capital, Molten actively supports its portfolio of companies, which is a typical behavior of a venture capitalist. So for those who haven't started their own business or are less familiar with the industry, if a venture capital or a VC invests in your business, they'll take a stake in it, and in return, they'll help you with strategy and finding the right people and resource planning and all that kind of stuff and board representation. So they'll also usually help in follow-on funding from other investors. That's typical VC behavior, and that's what Molten Capital does. And the firm's overarching goal is to help startups scale and position for successful exits, which could be a trade sale or an IPO. So it operates what's known as an evergreen model. And as a publicly listed entity, it can continually raise capital and reinvest proceeds from the portfolio exits when they sell a business into new opportunities rather than returning all the proceeds to limited partners on a set schedule, which is the way an awful lot of VCs behave. And this structure allows the firm to hold onto standout companies for longer periods when it believes that there's further growth potential. And when I look at their portfolio, which I have in front of me here, the names that might be known to our listeners from their consumer side, because I'm going to presume the consumer businesses are better known. They own a stake in Revolut, Free Trade, Crowdcube, which are three kind of trading platforms, List, Juno. When I look through their enterprise portfolio, there's a lot of names there. There must be, I suppose, 30 names at least. None of them are too familiar to me. Oh, and one of them is And Open, which is high-end gifting, premium gifting service. I think it's kind of a spin-off from Airbnb. I think the guys in there were in Airbnb. Anyway, you can jump on the internet and have a look at what they've invested in, who's their consumer tech, what's their enterprise tech, hardware, deep tech, digital wellness, and so on. So they have a big portfolio. And I listened to their last conference call, which is from November of last year, at which stage they had raised 76 million proceeds from realizing assets, selling assets and trade sales and raising cash. They had a 20 million pound gross profit fair value. And it's a business that's been kind of clobbered because a floated VC is quite a complex situation.
Yeah, I was
Because
gonna say I haven't heard about it too much. It's interesting how you talk about the classic VC
yeah,
model where everyone kind of gets paid off at a certain set schedule,
yeah,
where it's constantly iterating essentially as a public company. It's very different. Yeah.
it is very different. And its share price has kind of taken a beating. When I look at it on the Irish Stock Exchange, currently it's €3.02 a share. It's also listed, as I said, in London Stock Exchange with the ticker GROW, which I think is quite clever. But when I know the pedigree of the former pedigree, at least of the business and what they look for, I think it could be a very interesting one. There was a good sense of optimism from the CEO on his conference call, or sorry, on the board's conference call from November, that for various different reasons the business is going into a growth phase. So as I said at the top of this segment, I think it's an interesting company, genuinely interesting. When VC tells you your business is interesting, they want you to roll in a ball and die. Get out of my office when they say interesting. I heard it. And then I also heard the opposite as well, which was we'd like to invest. But interesting is the kiss of death from a VC. It's a terrible word. They should never use it. You should never use it to anyone when they tell you something interesting. It's quite insulting, isn't it, really? But it
Mm,
is the word of a VC is interesting. That's their get out,
yeah.
and don't look back. But anyway, I think that Molten looks really to me like a good potential investment. It's still very small. Its market cap as of now is 563 million euro. And it has a very impressive portfolio. And when I listened to the call, which I didn't really take notes from, I mean, they have a 75% core portfolio cash runway for the next year. They have 1.2 billion pounds in of net assets in the business. Uh, they have 82 million in cash. It's a business that looks structured very well. So it's a way of just getting exposed to businesses that just simply aren't available on the stock exchange yet. So whether you want to own a share, or sorry, I mean to say a stakeholding in a Revolut or one of those other businesses, many businesses it owns, this is the way to do it indirectly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It could provide some diversification to your portfolio because a lot of public investors won't have access to private companies. So, in a
Yeah,
sense, this is you being able to own a basket of private companies and make it a smaller part of your overall portfolio. So, it's interesting.
yeah,
Okay,
that's right.
Molten Ventures.
Okay,
What's the ticker?
that's Molten Ventures. It's ticker on the Irish Stock Exchange. What is
The
it?
Irish Stock Exchange, I suppose. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure. Actually, I don't have it here on my dashboard, but I do. I know it's grow in the London Stock Exchange, as I
Okay,
already
yeah.
said.
Well, and
Right.
unfortunately, that's how most people will be able to access it listening here is through the London Stock Exchange.
Right, Mike, hit me. What have you got?
Yeah, I've gone fairly basic for my first one. Flutter Entertainment. will know it as Paddy Power here in
Oh
Ireland,
yes.
but that's just one of its many companies that make up this gambling giant. It owns Betfair, FanDuel, PokerStars, Sky Betting, Gaming, Sportsbet. Unfortunately, it's no longer listed on the Irish Stock Exchange. Its primary listing is now on the New York Stock Exchange. It also has a secondary listing on the London Stock Exchange. Um, and that's probably indicative of where the business is headed, because FanDuel is just an absolute beast in the US.
Really?
Yeah, it's the largest.
Never even heard of it.
It's the largest US gambling company. It's ahead of DraftKings,
Oh.
and that market is just growing so fast.
But do
Through
they have a consumer facing brand? Like is
yes,
FanDuel a known brand? Oh,
yeah.
very interesting.
So that market is growing so fast, both through usage and then also through reach. So as more and more states legalize online gambling, immediately FanDuel runs to the top of the queue in that state. It's already the company's largest largest region by revenue, and FanDuel has roughly about 35 to 38% market share of the overall US market, making it a clear leader ahead of DraftKings in number two. But what's also a big advantage to Flutter as a whole, say, over DraftKings, is that it can participate in this land grab a lot easier than its main rival. So DraftKings' only market is the US, while Flutter has market leaders all over the world. I think it's got like a 45% market share in Australia, 30% market share in UK and Ireland. Really like cash cow businesses all over the world. And then in the US, where it's a bit of a growth at all cost strategy, and they just have to get new users on, and we'll figure out the expenditure later. It's able to fuel FanDuel through this, whereas DraftKings is on
Mm.
its own. DraftKings is basically running this unprofitable strategy in the hopes that eventually it'll pay off. While Flutter as a whole, maybe FanDuel might be losing money, but Flutter as a whole can run incredibly large amounts of cash flow that it can then put into its FanDuel expansion strategy. So in the most recent quarter, US revenue grew 51% year over year to
Whoa.
1.25 billion. It had in Q3 of this year, it had 43% of US net gaming revenue and 25% of iGaming gross share as well. iGaming would be online casino games and all the rest,
Mm.
which has been
Yeah.
growing hugely in popularity. We talk about Evolution Gaming a lot. Evolution Gaming would be the company that operates a lot of these games. So it's growing industry. The US opportunity is absolutely huge. It is spending like crazy to do so in the short term, which will be a red flag for a lot of people. But remember, it's only legal in 23 states right now. Like,
Yeah.
there's such an opportunity for expansion here. Missouri is a perfect example. So they just voted to legalize online gambling late last year, and they're going to go live in autumn of 2025. So analysts have this adding around 250 million to Flutter's revenue in the first year, straight off the bat. Do you know what I mean? Like,
It's
that's
amazing.
a great example of, okay, well, I held this vote. I think they passed like 51 to 49%. Do you know what I mean? And two
Races
years
on.
later, 250 million quid in FanDuel's pockets. So it's a huge opportunity. Management have it pegged as a 70 billion opportunity by 2030, and that's just the US. So think of that kind of level of expansion there. If they're at about 4 or 5 billion a year this year with 40% market share, what does that make it? So you're looking at 28 billion by 2030 if
Mm.
the back of the napkin maths are correct there. All FanDuel needs to do is basically keep its number one slot. It'll grow in iGaming too, is its ambition. So I think on a global level, the gambling industry is not probably it's probably too nascent to kind of say if it has blue chips or not. But if there is a blue chip in this entire industry, Flutter Entertainment is it. And the way it's able to kind of leverage its established markets and more traditional betting shops and stuff. And like, you see Paddy Power on nearly every high street, for good or for better or worse, unfortunately, in Ireland. But it can leverage that into high growth opportunities elsewhere. So the US, it's looking. I think it says it's going to have a $368 billion total addressable market by 2030 of all
Mm.
global regulated betting markets. So it's a huge opportunity. I think it's still in growth mode, even though it's a $45 billion business. And if you think gambling as a whole is a growth industry you want to be involved in, I don't think there is a better place to park your money than Flutter Entertainment right now.
That's a really strong pitch, Mike. I don't know what your next one is, but I'd imagine already that's going to be my favorite pitch. I wrote an article for the Motley Fool, I would say at least 25 years ago. I think it was the year 2000, on a business called CryptoLogic. And at that time, they provided the technology for all things to do with gambling online, or it was pre app, I guess, the year 2000. Yeah, it must have been online gaming, or I should say gambling tech. And serendipitously, back to the start of our conversation, it was actually headquartered here in Dublin, although I think it was just a door plate. And at that time, I'd have to brush off that article and reread it, but the market opportunity was immense. But what I got wrong was I overestimated the speed at which the market expands. But what I'm starting to get now is there's very real evidence that the market is properly expanding fast, as opposed to it will be this big by this time. And I made claims about how big the market would be when I wrote that piece 25 years ago, which quite sure I got wrong. I'd have to go back and look. And the one thing that I'd have a concern about is optimism baked into their numbers
Mm.
on the speed at which states accept gambling and gaming. Because I think America it's a funny country because it is the land of extremes. For every hyper conservative, there's a hyper liberal, and the bell curve stretches wider. So I think it's a very per state storyboard, but it's definitely a stock, a business that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so what do you got next for us?
Well, I'm going to be very obvious here. My second stock, I'm going to go. Well, I was actually thinking about going even higher risk than Molten, and I ended up researching a business which I'm not pitching now,
You can give it
called
honorable mention
an
status.
honorable mention, but it's worth a look at. I passed on it because there was too many unknowns. It was too small, too risky. But it's called Avoca Bio, uh, but it is, and it's one of the 30 on the main listing on our stock exchange. And the reason I dived in, I was like, I don't know who these people are, and I ended up reading quite a lot about the business, which I'm not going to even sideways pitch here now. But if you want to see a properly interesting business, uh, with very questionable to negligible to nearly zero revenues, have a look at that. No, they're not questionable; they're negligible.
Yeah.
They're very legit. So the other one, I up the other end of the scale, decided, right, I'm going to go way to the super obvious, to the brand that everybody knows, probably even more than Paddy Power, and it's Ryanair.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to revisit something we discussed on a podcast here, probably on several occasions, which is the economic rule of three, which suggests, as opposed to, insists that in a mature, stable market, three major players will dominate, just typically. And the rule puts that after a period of intense competition, there's a period of consolidation, and eventually the market coalesces around three principal firms that will forevermore enjoy the lion's share of profits and market share in that particular industry. And the phenomenon occurs as companies strive for economies of scale. And then they bring their marketing advantages, and then there's consumer loyalty, and usually smaller players will descend or find a niche in which they can operate. And when we think about the Paddy Power, Betfair, Flutter conversation, it has a whole family of brands. And if you're not one of them, you can just see you're probably going to have to obey or occupy a niche. Other examples, the US automotive industry in the mid 20th century, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, which were called the Big Three, and they dominated production and sales of automotive for years until a disruptor came along. In soft drinks in America, there's Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper. And this kind of rule emerges, or kind of asserts itself eventually in mature industries. And whether it's auditors or whether it's, you name it, like it's telecoms providers in every country, there's usually just two or there's three competitors in the mobile space, and so on and so forth. So a mature triopoly will emerge in well-established markets. And in Europe's low-cost airline market, when you look at who are the dominant players in Europe's low-cost aviation market, carrier market, it's Ryanair, EasyJet, and as far as I'm concerned, in far third place is Wizz Air, which they are defined as the big three or triopoly. But
Are they?
seriously,
Yeah. Jesus, I haven't heard of Wiz in years.
I never heard of them at all. Like until I actually, when I went to research who, in fact, are the competitors, are Wizz Air, who are Wizz Air?
Are they still? Sorry, no, I'm not a question here,
Right.
but are they still flipping?
No, please do question me because I don't want to make this pitch for Ryanair about the economic rule of three. I was just trying to reinforce the point to say, look, whether it's baked beans or cars or whatever it is, effectively, there's rarely to never more than three brands,
Yeah,
and very often it is three. But I thought, man, who are Ryanair's? Wizz Air? What have you
yeah.
got there? Have you done some light internet research?
Just was like, are they still in business? I think they are. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, anyway, Ryanair most certainly is. And it is a brand that is so big that I think most traveled Americans will know very well of Ryanair, even though the brand doesn't exist in America. And when I look at its key stats for the year ending March 2024, which was a bit of time away, it carried 184 million guests, has 584 aircraft, it has 3,500 flights a day, it serves 235 airports. I mean, that is a
mm.
very complex um, and valuable asset to actually have landing space in all of those airports, 95 base airports, and so on. But when you look at what matters in a business, Ryanair's revenue, and we've discussed that revenue growth is the singularly most important metric for long-term share price appreciation. And when I plotted Ryanair's 10-year revenue growth, of course, it had a horrible 2021 as a consequence of the unmentionable, and the year after was a slight recovery, but it was very much up, 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 up. It looked like the trajectory of a Ryanair plane taking off. It's
So so really shaky at the start and then fast and then down and up again.
I'll leave you answer to Mr. Michael O'Leary, the CEO, if you're going to say anything disparaging. But its CAGR for revenue has been 10% per year over 10 years, which for what is a mature business is quite unbelievable. And revenue continues to grow. And the reason I'm pitching Ryanair is to remember that we invest for decades. We don't invest for days or weeks or even just a handful of years. So the question one needs to ask themselves is, do you think Ryanair would be bigger or smaller in 10 years?
Yeah,
That's simple. It means it's pretty.
simplify it to one question, and there's only
And the
one
same,
answer, isn't there?
well, I believe so. And the same, I
100%.
actually
Yeah.
believe so for Flutter.
Okay.
I believe less so for Molten because it is, as I said, it's a very interesting, to use their own word, back in business. But I would certainly have a high conviction that Ryanair and Paddy Power Betfair. Hold on a minute. What's the name of your business again? The official name?
Flutter Entertainment, I think, is the
Flutter Entertainment.
on
So
the
when I
board.
look at Flutter Entertainment and Ryanair and just say, well, what's my sense based on everything your hunch is the assembly of everything you've ever heard about something to arrive at a point, a decision. And my hunch is Ryanair will be bigger in 10 years. My hunch is Flutter Entertainment will be bigger in 10 years. And that's why I'm pitching Ryanair, because it's almost like the yin to the yang that was Molten. So I think by putting together, you're going with quite significantly high risk with quite significantly low risk. And we invest in the CEOs, founding CEOs. And while Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, isn't quite a founder, he nearly is.
It's kind of like Elon Musk, the Tesla vibe.
Yes, actually, very good analogy. But as I said, I have my absolute number one favorite Irish company stands away from all of these, but it's in Horizon, I'm afraid. You know well what it is, and I think it's a wonderful business. So it isn't Ryanair, it isn't Molten, and it isn't listed on the Irish Stock Exchange, but it's as Irish as potatoes and cabbage, folks. But believe me, I believe its future is ginormous, and it's one of the stocks that I have repeatedly bought in recent months in Horizon.
Okay,
Casual second
Ryanair.
plug. Ryanair, yes. So what
And
have you got for
it was a very good Ryanair pitch because you were trying to sell us something else at the end of it as well.
The long game. I was like, okay, I'm going to get everybody hooked on Ryanair and then tell them I have a better one. But yeah, Ryanair and Molten are two super interesting businesses. And I say it isn't properly interesting. I think they're fascinating. The storyboards are very compelling, and the future is bright for both.
Yeah. Okay. So my
So,
last
what's your
one,
second one? Iverado, to use the Irish language, being this is
ever
an Irish
though,
show.
have you ever heard of the company AerCap?
Oh, I have, yeah,
Yeah,
very
yeah,
much
yeah.
so. They probably changed the GDP of Ireland, is the truth.
Yeah. Well, so this is the funny thing. Like, I don't know. It probably was a thing when you were in college as well. But I remember, especially when I was in college, any graduates, the real big money job was in aircraft leasing. That's where if you're smart enough and like really wanted to make money, that's where you go as a graduate.
Really? No,
Yeah.
that wasn't a thing when I was in college. Although I grew up with my best friend growing up. He and his family moved down to Limerick as his father was recruited for GPA, Guinness Peak Aviation,
So
and his
this
dad
is
was.
this is the origins. Go on.
That's right. And his dad was recruited. His name was Morris Foley. And my friend's name was Brian Foley, but his dad's name was Morris Foley, as far as I know. He's RIP now, but he was the driving force in the early stages of this industry. And they, in a time pre-internet, just disappeared off to Limerick, never to be seen again.
Yeah.
And if Brian listens to this show, drop me a note. I'd love to hear from you. But it was, but I could go on about that because there was so many things I observed at the time. But the origins of this industry are big, and the industry is ginormous. So tell
Yeah.
us,
So it's a
AerCap.
really interesting story, and I'm going to tell you the history of, we'll say, AerCap, and it kind of reminds me a bit of, do you know, in Only Fools and Horses, where Trigger has a broom that he had for 20
Yes,
years, and it's had
yeah,
17 new handles and 14 new heads, but it's the same
yes.
broom. So
Leonard
this,
Skinner is the same. The band, they've swapped them all out one at a time, and you'd
yeah,
like, hold on a minute, this isn't Leonard Skinner. That's
or
something else.
the Irishman, what is it? The Waterboys have had like 10 new
Have
members
they?
since its origins.
Have
Yeah.
they? Oh, what a scam! Because I'm going over to see them in Edinburgh in June with my
They'd still be
family.
great. You still see the whole
Well,
of them. But
Ben Scott is still there, knocking out all the bangers. Once the singer is there, you can kind of still go, yeah, it's still the band.
yeah. Okay. Well, similar
Or
thing
Mike
with,
Scott, Mike Scott, not Ben Scott.
but basically a similar thing with AerCap. So it's been
Yeah.
through so many acquisitions and buyouts and restructurings that you can't really tell which way is up. But its origins do lie in GPA, Guinness Peak Aviation. So this
Ah,
company was set up in 1975 by Aer
right.
Lingus, the Guinness Peak Group, which is a financial firm from London, and then Tony Ryan, who would later
Yeah.
go on to found Ryanair.
Reiner.
Yeah,
Yes.
he was an Aer Lingus executive at the time. So very much Irish roots. What happens in the meantime? So I actually want to run through it because it's quite an interesting story. So like anything steeped in Irish business or financial history, they got too ambitious. It went a little bit tits up. They went into huge
Really.
debt. Uh, so in 1991, the Gulf War took a big hit on all air travel.
Mm.
And I think GPA owed like something like 10 billion quid in 1992, and it was going to go out of business. And then it was essentially rescued and restructured on the cheap with the help of General Electric's Capital Aviation Services, so GECAS, which is an
Right.
important name because we're going to come back to that. But then owned most of the shares. That was in 1992. So the GPA would continue to operate under kind of this GECAS ownership until November 98, when Texas Pacific Group acquired 62% of the shares. They changed the name of the company to AirFi Group. So Guinness Peak Aviation is now AirFi.
Yeah.
AirFi would then go on to acquire Indigo Aviation, making it one of the biggest aircraft leasers in the world again. In November 2000, a year later, AirFi was then acquired by Debis Air Finance. So that was actually an affiliate of, you mentioned Chrysler earlier, Daimler Chrysler.
Yeah.
So still called AirFi, now owned by Debis Air Finance. March 2005, Debis Air Finance was acquired by Cerberus Capital, and then it was subsequently renamed AerCap and went public in 2006. So
Very interesting.
technically, we're still Guinness Peak Aviation somehow. In May 2014, AerCap acquired International Lease Finance Corporation from AIG for 3 billion quid, made it the second largest leasing company in the world to, who did we mention earlier?
I don't know, Mike. Who did we?
General Electric Capital
Oh,
Aviation
GE,
Service.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we come full
Don't quiz
circle.
me. I'm listening.
We come full circle to 2021, almost 30 years on from when General Electric essentially bought out Guinness Peak Aviation. And AerCap would acquire General Electric Capital Aviation Services and make it the world's
Oh,
largest aircraft leasing company in the world.
isn't that unbelievable?
So I don't know if you could call this business the Guinness Peak Aviation Company, but you kind of could.
Mm.
It's still, in fairness, headquartered in Dublin and has offices in Shannon. So it is very much an Irish-rooted company, although it's been through the ringer a few times, a bit like Trigger's Broom. And yeah, much like its history, it's incredibly complex business. I feel like you need an accounting degree to go through its investor relations page. So I'm not going to overcomplicate this, but just try to give a quick rundown. It's, as I said, the world's largest aircraft leasing company. It owns 2,306 assets, 1,462 passenger aircraft, 75 freighter aircraft, 458 aircraft engines, and then 311 helicopters. It also either manages or has on order about 1,200 more. So it has a few revenue lines. It makes money from maintenance, financing, other ancillary services, but basically 90% of revenue comes from just leasing out these assets. Customers are world's major airlines like American Airlines, Air France. It also has Amazon, which rents out its freight planes, and Aramco, I thought was interesting, is one of its major helicopter customers as well. Trades under the ticker AER on the New York Stock Exchange. 18 billion market cap. And don't get scared when you read this because it's got an 18 billion market cap and technically has a $63 billion enterprise value. So there's
Mm.
$45 billion of debt on the books. But there's
Mm.
also, as I said, 3,500 assets in terms of aircraft and engines and freight planes and helicopters that amount to about 60 something billion. So it trades at around book value, which is an important metric to look for a company
Oh,
this
interesting.
asset
Right.
heavy.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Right.
Book value is basically just net assets. It's also trading, again, it's trading at around 8 times earnings, which is really, really cheap if you were looking at a normal business. I don't think this can be grouped as a normal business. If you look at its historical price to earnings ratio, it's never getting above double digits. And it comes for a lot of reasons. It's obviously cyclical, asset heavy, lots of costs, lots of financial implications. Makes it really hard to put a proper valuation on it. But yeah, I see why investors don't flock to it. It's basically one big accounting exercise.
You said it. You stole the thought out of my mind because it seems like it's above all else, the element of that business that requires the greatest level of expertise is financial mathematics
Yeah, yeah.
and
But
understanding the flow of capital.
100%, and that's true. But you don't, what's easy to understand is that at an $18 billion market cap, it bought back $1.5 billion worth of shares in the first 3 quarters of 2024. So
Wow.
immediately, like you're like adding 9% of like commensurate value to the shares you already own there for shareholders. So there's a lot of positives. Again, it's probably business we're not qualified to fully analyze in a sense. I think you need a much rounder understanding of the financials ins and outs of it, but it's profitable, dominant market share in a lucrative industry with loads of barriers to entry. Outside of the pandemic, its utilization rate, so basically how much of its vehicles it had rented out, never fell below 98% in the past 15 years. And as well as that, it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of the overall global aircraft fleet. The leasing is. So in 2003, 30% of global aircrafts were leased out. That moved up to 50% in 2023. And there's reasons for this, especially in the last 5 years. So there's kind of an imbalance of supply and demand that came up as air travel rebounded so quickly after the pandemic. Aircraft production didn't, mostly from Boeing. Boeing's got so many issues, but Airbus as well. They haven't really ramped up production as fast as, because like air travel now is more popular than it was in 2019. to kind of ramp back up production to those levels, it's behind and will probably be for a few years. So that's kind of, excuse the pun, but a bit of a tailwind for the business that looks like it'll stick around for a couple of years, just because it makes the fleet that AerCap has much more in demand and like increases pricing power as well. Stock's up about 30% over the past year, and it does look like it has a nice runway. That's another pun. Um, to continue this momentum, at least while that supply demand imbalance is there. So, and if it continues to buy back shares at the rate it is, yeah, it could be a winner, but it's a very complex business to try and understand.
And it's absolutely amazing between Avalon and AerCap, the impact that they've had on Ireland. These businesses are swimming in cash. I want to say they don't know what to do with it. They do know what to do with it. They're buying back shares and rewarding their executives to retain key talent. And but when you are exposed to that industry from the inside, if you go into one of their headquarters, you really see what a business with a ton of cash looks like.
Yeah, 100%. And what I love about it is that when Guinness Peak Aviation, this is in early 90s, was at its peak, I think it controlled about 10% of global aircrafts
Wow.
from an office in Shannon in County Clare. Do you know what I mean?
Isn't that amazing?
Unreal.
And it's just the ownership model. I think there's two types of businesses: those that want to own the assets and those that want to stick with the branding and the operations.
Yeah, it's an old school business like this, and we've always talked about how asset light is such an advantage for a stock, and
Yeah.
this is the complete opposite. This is asset heavy, and being the middleman. But I suppose just taking advantage of what is an incredibly complex industry and being the one in the middle that's able to, yeah, able to take advantage. So that's AerCap, priced incredibly cheap. There's a lot of advantages there, even just from the financial kind of, just from the financial implications of its business continues to do what it's doing and it buys back shares at that rate. That's going to lead to stock appreciation, if nothing else.
So we've pitched two ostensibly aviation businesses, Ryanair and AerCap, and then we have Molten and Flutter. If you could only buy one of those, which would you buy?
Flutter, I think. I'd like to say AerCap, but I think I'd need another 3 weeks to properly research it before I could give a answer fully.
And the same for me with Molten. I'd need to give it a few more weeks of research, which I'm not going to do to actually get fully behind it. But I agree with your choice. So we're both agreed of the four stocks pitched today, Flutter would get our dollar.
Yeah, for me, anyways. Yeah.
Oh no, easily for me too as well. When I listen to those four pitches, Flutter is the one.
Okay, that was fun. I enjoyed that. Now it's good.
I
Like,
did. Thanks, Kieran Power in Germany, my friend, who WhatsApped me. So hopefully that delivered, and we'll get on with the wider world from next week, I presume, Mike.
yeah. Well, geez, tell you what, there's some global businesses there at the same time.
Oh yeah.
For a
Oh,
weak
not to
country.
suggest that. Look, don't you? Nobody say a word against Ireland. You have to face up to me and Mike.
Yeah.
We're the gatekeepers of the Irish brand when it comes to stock investing.
Okay. All right. That was great, Emmet. I enjoyed that.
Me too.
Thank you for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening in. Remember, if you want to give us a rating, we only accept 5 stars, but if you
Yeah.
are willing to give us a 5-star, it does help the show. So whatever podcast platform you're listening to us, just throw us a little 5-star. And that's it. We'll talk to you next week.